Welcome to this episode of Lessons from the Cockpit Show. I am your host, Mark Hacera. For over 24 and a half years, I flew the KC-135, an airplane that I wanted to fly ever since I was 5 years old, standing on the hood of my grandpa Andy's car, watching Boeing 707s and Douglas DC-8s landing and taking off at Los Angeles International Airport. It was then that I found my passion, because I said to myself, why work for a living when I can do this? And for over 60 years now, I've been around airplanes. Ask any pilot to define flying, and they're probably going to tell you long periods of boredom interrupted by short, intermittent periods of extreme terror. On the Lessons from the Cockpit Show, we debrief the most fascinating and intriguing pilots, weapon system operators, maintainers, and aviation enthusiasts from all over the world. Our show investigates the tactics, techniques, and procedures these aviators created or cultivated during those extreme and extraordinary military, commercial, and private flying operations. This exploration gives our listeners practical advice on how the aviation world works and expands our critical thinking skills and expertise in the air and on the ground. Many of these stories you're going to hear here for the very first time. On this episode of Lessons from the Cockpit, you're going to meet one of my childhood buddies. We've known each other since we were 10 years old. Mike Reed, callsign Coma. Coma was a weapon system operator in the F-4E Phantom flying missions out of Osan, Korea, and Clark Air Base, the Philippines. Coma's going to share with us how he got his passion for airplanes, and I found out something about his family, particularly his father, that I didn't know, particularly after all this time I spent in his house. Geopolitics affected both Mike and I's career when we were coming into the Air Force and while we were stationed in the Pacific. And Coma has some fascinating stories on how geopolitics affected his career in the military. Coma's mom was 13 years old when the Japanese invaded the Philippines during World War II, and she talked to him about some very horrible things that happened during that time period. But she also taught him the art of moving along. Don't let the things that happen to you affect your future. So, grab an adult beverage of your choice, sit down, strap in, and let's begin the Lessons from the Cockpit Show. And today, we have Coma in the house.
How's it going, Sluggo?
It's going great.
Great. What? It's been a while. It's been a while. We have a history, don't we?
About 5 years. Okay, so our background. We have known each other for over 50 years, at least.
God, it's hard to believe. 50 years.
Because we met in elementary school in Dunwoody, Georgia.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And we were both airplane crazy even then.
It's amazing how this has come across. When you look back there, it seems like a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. And yet you follow your dreams, you follow your passions, and the next thing you know, you have a lifetime of stories.
Isn't that the truth?
Yeah. Been wild. Been wild.
So how did you get started with airplanes?
Interesting you should ask. My father was a B-29 pilot in the Pacific Theater of Operations during World War II. Oh, yeah. He never talked much about it, but he was always proud of the fact that he flew for the Army Air Corps. But he got out of the service, and when he left the service, he got a job with an American lumber company in the Philippines. Met my mother. Spent 14 years in the Philippines running sawmills and in the lumber business. And after pumping out 5 kids, decided it was time to bring them back to the States and educate them there. We settled in Atlanta, Georgia. Never talked about, when I was growing up, his time in the Army Air Corps. I just didn't know that much about it. But he still had a passion burning in him for airplanes. And, we did the little things, make little glider things and flying them and all that, and that was fine. But one day when I was 11 years old, my father bought me a Cox J87 Stuka, and it was a control line airplane. Gas-powered, you wind it up, and I was deathly afraid of this thing because I was afraid when I'd start up that motor, it was going to cut my finger off, which it actually did cut it a couple times because I was not smart enough to move my finger out of the way fast enough.
Yeah.
But anyway, I got to where I got comfortable with it, started flying this thing around, and I actually started to like this thing. I thought it was really cool. I started imagining myself flying inside this airplane, even though it was a German airplane. And I got more and more, because of that, I got more and more involved in stories about World War II. Through some conversation, that my father let me know that he was in World War II, and he flew B-29s, and I didn't know what a B-29 was, so I started reading more about that. I got into the library at the elementary school, and one thing begot another, and before you know it, I was fascinated by World War II aviation and the fighters and the bombers and everything that went along with it. And I started gravitating towards watching World War II movies back then. You had a couple of them, and then one day when I was in ninth grade, no, it was actually before that, probably in my seventh grade, I saw the movie 12 O'Clock High. And
great movie.
I was absolutely Gregory Peck. I mean,
the coffee cup.
It was more than just the mission mug.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was.
But your dad flew bombers.
He did, and he wore that uniform, and I was able to look in his old pictures and find pictures of him wearing the pinks, and I was absolutely impressed because in that movie, even though it was black and white, you had guys in the pinks, and unlike movies today, these guys were like heroes. I mean, they acted, they acted like men, they talked like men, they were serious about it, and of course, they were doing things that were dangerous. They were doing things that, you take off and you may not come back, and that became the hallmark of what solidified my impression of what it was to be a military aviator at the time. So I knew at that point, no kidding, that early in my life, I knew that's what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a military aviator. I wanted to be like them. And that's what got me. So my father was the one that got me involved in it. Well, in the meantime, during my early years, 14, 15, 16, I got involved in an organization called the Civil Air Patrol, which, as you know, is the auxiliary of the United States Air Force. And they had themselves had a play in World War II as a civilian auxiliary looking for German submarines just off the coast, which, of course, were sinking some of our shipping. Now, Civil Air Patrol was great, and I got involved with them to the point where I was doing search and rescue missions, but also it was heavy in aviation as far as aviation training and history. And I got even more involved in that. It also gave me much more of an orientation of what the modern Air Force was like or going to be like if I ever wanted to go in.
Yeah.
And I started to develop a fancy for it. But what it did do is Civil Air Patrol gave me a 15-hour scholarship that paid for my flying lessons. And they gave me 15 hours, and I sold it in about 11. And so the remaining time, I used their money or my money to continue that flying until I was eventually ready to go to college. Then I had to stop some of that because going to college means I had to pay for college. My parents were great. They were the finest parents you could ever have.
His parents are great.
And as
spent so much time over at his house when I was a kid. We were almost inseparable.
Oh, well, I can tell you right now, Dad, the more I did that, the more Dad, surprisingly enough, he didn't bring up his old stories. He just wanted to, I guess, live vicariously through me, as little as that was. But the more I learned about him, the more I appreciated. It became synergistic. Yeah. The more I wanted to know more.
Yeah.
And I started thinking about going to the Air Force Academy. Okay, so that was a story in itself. Going to the Air Force Academy, Civil Air Patrol was very easy because I learned a lot about things that most kids at that age do not know.
Yeah.
Because you really need a mentor to walk you through that. It's quite a process, and that process really starts when you're, or 10th grade rather. And then if you're not really into doing the things you need to do to get into the academy, which, by the way, is about the same for if you want to get a military scholarship through ROTC, then you're behind the power curve. And a lot of people don't get that kind of mentorship. Well, Civil Air Patrol provided that. So if nothing else, it provided me an insight and a pathway and the direction on how I need to do that. Plus, it hooked me up with the air liaison officers that were going to be instrumental in being able to help that. Well, as it turns out, even though I was doing very well in high school, I didn't do so well in the SATs because I just took it on a whim, didn't prepare for it, didn't study for it, and I didn't do well at all. And they said, look, we really think that you're the type of guy we wanted in the Air Force Academy, because I was captain of the high school wrestling team. I was president of the aeronautical club by that point in high school. I was working, not full-time, but part-time in various jobs. And I was, at that point in my life, I was a junior in high school, and I was the cadet squadron commander and the Southeast region Civil Air Patrol Outstanding Cadet of the Year. So all that wrapped up, and so into one package said, really, I was the right guy to be going to the Air Force Academy, except for the fact that even though my grades were AB grades, my SAT was terrible. So they said, here's what we want to do. Gotten a nomination. For that point, I'd already gotten a nomination from Senator Nunn's office, who at the time was the Senate Armed Service, Chief of Senate Armed Service.
Senator Sam Nunn.
Yeah, absolutely.
Big guy.
And,
big time guy.
Big name.
Big name.
And anyway, I was able to do that, but I couldn't get accepted to the academy because the SAT scores were so low. So what I ended up doing was they wanted me to go to the prep school. Well, again, here's where the mentor comes in. Silly me, I just said, I don't want to go there. If I go to the prep school, that means I have to be at the academy for 5 years, not 4, 5 years. You know, and I haven't got time for that. And so I decided to just turn that down. Now, in retrospect, that was probably one of the dumbest moves I could have possibly made. As a kid at that age, I did not understand geopolitics. Okay, and throughout this entire journey, a lot of lessons were learned the hard way by making mistakes. And that was one of my mistakes. And so as I came through, I turned them down, and I started going through a regional school called Southern Tech at the time in Marietta, Georgia. And I was going to major in something I liked because I like to draw, and I was going to major in architecture.
Yeah. He was a terrific artist when we were kids.
Yeah, well, I could have done better, but thank you.
He was a terrific artist when we were kids.
Anyway, so I did about a year and a half of that, and it became apparently obvious to me, this is not what I really want to do in life. I really want to be involved with airplanes. I really want to be involved in building airplanes, flying airplanes, being part of airplanes, and I really want to be in the U.S. military. And so it just so happened that at Georgia Tech, some guy had dropped out of Georgia Tech. He was on scholarship. 3.5 years of his 4-year full scholarship still left, and by that time I was making good grades. I was already in the school, and so I was already taking ROTC courses, crosstown enrollment. I applied for it, the Air Force ROTC scholarship, and won it. And they selected me, handed it to me, and that was category 1 piece. So if I graduated, then I would go to undergraduate pilot training. So now I'm on the right track. Shortly after that, and of course, this is where geopolitics that you don't know as a kid comes into play. All right.
Yeah.
Jimmy Carter was the president. And as typical as you see with the Democratic Party, they're notorious for cutting the budget. They have a different philosophy. And of course, we had just finished the Vietnam War. Being in the military wasn't a popular thing. So here I am going against the grain yet again. Along with that came a reduction in the demand for military pilots. Now, this is the part of geopolitics that you can't factor into your life, nor do you even know that's coming down the pipe.
Yeah.
And so, well, what that meant was all of the people that were going to be graduating for the next 2 or 3 years, their pilot slot just went away.
Gone.
If you were not an academy graduate, you did not get a pilot slot because those were that was the only money they had was to fill the pilot slots with what with the graduating classes. And of course, the academies were graduating regular officers as opposed to the reserve officers, which came out of ROTC and officer candidate schools. That meant anybody that was junior or senior lost their slot. And they gave us the option to either stay in or finish, if we were already on scholarship, finish your scholarship at the expense of the U.S. government, and then you can leave and not go in the military, and they'd be happy. You get your, well, that was fine, but I wanted to go in the military.
Yeah.
That was not part of my plan to just get out. And I wanted to go to the military as an aviator. There are no pilot slots. However, we still have the need for military engineers, and we still have the need for military navigators. If you understand the navigators, they are in more than just one airplane, okay? And they do much more than navigate. There are navigators, there are electronic warfare officers, there are weapon systems officers, all come through the navigator schools and then go out into different operational platforms and different operational tasks. My thought was, okay, if I go to nav school, I'm still flying, I can possibly transfer over to pilot training later on at some point in time. Now, this is where my last earlier decision comes home to roost. Had I accepted the academy's
Prep school,
I would have been in the academy at this point, and I would have had nothing to worry about. And I would have graduated and gone straight to pilot training. As it is, now I'm going in as a navigator. That's assuming, of course, I finish college and assuming that I go into nav school sometime down the road. So here I am. They've thrown a wrench in my plans and whatever plans I may have had. And yes, it always helps to have a plan, but better yet, it always helps to have a backup plan. Now, at this point, I'm pretty irritated. In fact, I've really got the beak. In fact, no. I really don't have the beak. I've got the Mozambique at this point. I've really got it bad. I've got a bad attitude. And I'm looking at Georgia Tech's detachment, which was very gracious by giving me this scholarship.
Yeah.
And I'm angry at them because it's not the scholarship I wanted. It's the scholarship that I'm going to have to accept. Either that or, since I'm paying for college, there's no way I drop out of college. So that is the choices left before me with what we had to work with. But I was angry with them, so I actually, with Air Force scholarships, with military scholarships in general, if you get a scholarship, you have the opportunity to go to any school that has an ROTC detachment. At that point, knowing already that I wanted to do something other than architecture, and I really didn't want to go to school in downtown Atlanta with Georgia Tech's campus, I decided, you know what? I'm going to pick up stakes and I'm going to go to Auburn. And Auburn University was a beautiful campus that was in the plains of Alabama. And it was close enough to home and close enough to the beach and close enough, a lot of places, close enough to Montgomery and Atlanta and all the places I wanted to be, but I didn't want to stay there because I didn't need the disruption while I was going through college. And so I went to Auburn University sight unseen. I'm going to put my stake ground here, and I'm going to change my major to aerospace engineering, which is in fact what I did. So I applied at Auburn. They accepted me right away. I ended up going down because remember, at this point, the SAT no longer matters.
Yeah,
it was your grade point average that mattered at this point.
Yep.
And I went to Auburn University, started there. My complete class schedule was thrown through the roof. I mean, it was completely tossed out. So I had to work literally every quarter to make up courses that were out of cycle.
Yeah.
In order to be able to graduate relatively on time. Able to pretty much recover most of it, with the exception of 2 design courses that I needed, but were not going to be offered in the time frame necessary for me to graduate on the original plan that we had set. The problem with that was, of course, that the funding for my scholarship ended on the original plan. So now I had another dilemma as I'm going into my senior year. How do I clep those 2 design courses, which really tied all of the aerospace engineering curriculum together, be able to graduate on time? So I walked into the Dean of Aerospace Engineering's office at the time, and I decided, I got a proposition. How about if I do a senior project, use that senior project with a thesis, validating the thesis. How about if I use that as evidence to collect the course? Well, to my surprise, Auburn was pretty open to a lot of opportunities, and you know what? Okay, on the proviso that you have 3 tenured professors, Sheep heard your project and approve your thesis, and have the senior design professor, a guy named Dr. John Burkhalter, who was one of the stalwarts of the aerospace engineering department at the time. He had to grade it, and whatever grade you get is the 2 grades you're going to have. And so I said, fair enough. So there started another adventure of actually going in, designing, building, and testing this design and proving my thesis was in fact correct. There was the other proviso that also came in, and that is if it was successful, then I had to deliver or present my findings to the American Institute for Aeronautics and Astronautics, the AIAA, in Southeast Regional competition against other engineering schools at the upcoming conference, which was going to be in March in 1980. So I set about basically going to Auburn Woodshop, which no longer exists now, and since I didn't have the budget authority to do anything, I just grabbed hardwood in trash bins, laminated together, hand carved out a design that I had been looking at current magazines at the time about research aircraft that were exploring transonic flight and maneuverability as well as aeroelastic tailoring. And I stumbled on one from Rockwell International, referred to as highly maneuverable and advanced technology, and it was a cool design. And I said, I'm going to design something like that.
That was HIMAT.
That was HIMAT. That was HIMAT. That was the big thing back then.
Yeah.
Because back there in the late 70s, everybody wanted to have canards on their design. That was a big thing. And many companies and countries actually ended up followed that philosophy of design. But anyway, so I designed a model and built the model based on this trash wood that I had found and had to size it to fit the wind tunnel test section. And I had some great help from a guy named Mr. Holbrook, who was our senior technician at the School of Engineering, to help me mount it on the sting mount so it didn't trash the tunnel. And we tested it. And right off the bat, the thing was unstable for flight in longitudinal axis because they have this thing called the tail volume ratio, which is basically the ratio of your tail empennage against your main wing and your main airfoil, to put it simply. And mine was too small, and so I had to adjust it. So I doubled the size of that, ended up with it back on the sting mount, and we tested it again, and sure enough, it was now stable. It was for at least normal flight. Then we had to go through the whole process of going through different configurations to test this model to validate or disvalidate the whole premise. My whole premise was if you put a canard in front and you don't put it properly, you could end up with bad airflow off the canard and completely mess up your aerodynamics of your airplane. Conversely, if you did it properly, it would actually enhance your maneuverability, especially in high angle, low speed flight. So I set off to do this. After about 3.5 months worth of testing and 60 test runs later, I came up with enough data that actually showed exactly what my thesis had stated. One run in particular was such that, yes, we proved that there was a vortex sheet that came off the canards that actually impinged on the main wing in such a way that at high angles of attack, airflow did not experience separation, which means even though the canard was stalling, the main wing was actually still flying, and it actually increased lift on the main wing, which offset each other. So if you had enough thrust to hold the airplane up, you could literally tail walk that airplane. Well, that was unusual for an undergraduate to discover something like this.
Yeah.
That was something a whole lot different. You were in the graduate level stuff there. Well, I didn't care. I didn't know better. I was just doing what I thought would work.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And now here it is 40 years later, and they've come completely back around.
Moved from there. So everything worked out there. And I went to the Air Force. The Air Force was another thing altogether. Going into the Air Force was, to say the least, an adventure. So I went through nav school, and there were 50 people in our graduating class for flight school. Right away, 2 or 3 dropped out. Because, as you know, military flight school is not something that's for the faint of heart.
It is not easy.
You're there, and especially during a time when they don't need aviators because of the budget. You drop out, or if you're not doing very well, they don't keep you on very long. They just say, adios, amigos. And so, as a general rule, the top 10% of the class would get their first choice, if they could swing it. So, which means if you have a class of 50, that means the top 5 get their first choice.
Top 5 guys, yeah.
That's it. You are literally working your butt off for 12 months, 13 months, as long as flight school. It's one of the longest military training programs.
Yeah.
Undergraduate pilot training and undergraduate navigator training that there is in the military. If you are not in the top 5, then you get whatever comes down for a pick. And for me, I wanted fighters. I really wanted fighters because I thought that's where the action was going to be, and I thought that was cool. And I was really shooting for either going to be an F-4 Phantom or an F-111, which is the only 2 fighters at the time that really had a navigator in the back. Commonly referred to as a weapons systems officer, or WISO for short. And so I worked probably as hard as I've ever worked. Even though I enjoyed the flying, you were spending a lot of time in mission prep and training, academics prep, because there's 3 parts of the training program. There's obviously academic testing that you had to excel in, but there was also simulator testing that you had to excel in, and then, of course, you had to excel in flight. Every day there was some instructor looking over your shoulder constantly.
Grading you on everything.
On everything. I mean, every time you sneezed, they graded. I felt, but that's what it took. Well, I was able to be, after it was all over, I ended up in one of the top 5 in my class. I wasn't number 1, but I wasn't number 50 either, or however many we had left in my class. And that we were going to be graduating in 1981. As we got into there, just by absolute luck, our class got 5 drops when the selection process came down. We got 5 drops of F-4 Phantoms. The rest of it was a scattering of C-130s, KC-135 tankers,
C-141s,
and a
B-52s.
whole lot of B-52s.
Imagine that.
Because a B-52 has 3 navs on it at the time.
Yeah.
You had an RN, a BN, and an EWO.
Yep, you're going to get circumcised.
That's a fact. Epic as that job is, you're sitting in an airplane with no windows. Okay.
For a long time.
Had windows for the pilots, but no windows for the navigators. Okay. They were having long missions, and that's and of course most of the SAC bases at the time were up north.
Yep.
It's another thing I didn't really want.
Northern tier.
So I desperately wanted to get into the fighter community. And I was able to luckily enough, pull an F-4, then went through lead-in fighter training at Holloman Air Force Base, which just got you that next step to do a high-speed performance aircraft, even though you weren't doing a whole lot in the fighter world. You were just orienting yourself towards the fighter world. And then went through a 6-month course called Replacement Training Unit, called RTU, at Luke Air Force Base to teach you how to actually go to war in a weapon system of choice, which was, for me, the F-4 Phantom.
Yep.
And that's when it started to become fun. And that's when it was really interesting, because I didn't really, the old adage comes into play. If you like what you're doing, then you'll never work a day in your life.
Yep.
Well, that's pretty much the way it worked out for me, because now I'm in my element. I'm happy. I may not be flying the airplane, but we're certainly doing a lot in the back of a Phantom that made it pretty fun. When you're hunting down other airplanes or dropping bombs on targets on the ground,
you're running the mission.
It's actually we're doing a lot of things that are so unique.
Yeah.
Stuff that you go back to the the bar in the O Club that night and you think, I can't believe they're paying me to do this stuff, which was the big joke.
Yeah.
After 6 months of that, the drop comes down. Of course, we fill out our dream sheets. So where would you like to be assigned if we can swing it? And I will give personnel office a nod here that they did try to fill those when they could.
Yeah.
Well, I was single at the time, and I wanted to be the guy that hunts in the air. I didn't want to be the guy that was doing all the bombing. There were only 2 F-4 Phantom bases at that time because they were winding down F-4 Phantoms at that time in favor of the new F-15 and F-16s that were coming online as an operational frontline fighter.
Yeah.
And so there was only 2 bases that actually did air-to-air, and they were Keflavik Air Base and Osan Air Base, both during the Cold War at different ends of the spectrum. One involved with the European theater operations, that being Keflavik, and they would of course chase and monitor the Bear traffic, the Russian bomber traffic coming from the North Sea into Europe and down into the Atlantic. And then of course there was the other one, and that was of course North and South Korea, with the DMZ as the demarcation line between the communist North and of course the capitalist South. 15 minutes as the crow flies from the DMZ was Osan Air Base. Smack dab in the middle of it was the 36th Fighter Squadron flying F-4Es, and that's what I put down on my dream sheet, number 1. The second one, Keflavik.
Yeah.
Well, I was pinpointing where I want to be. Now, a lot of people looked at me like, what kind of idiot are you? Those are both remote tours. You can't have fun there. You can't do anything over there. I said, that's where I want to be. They gave me Osan Air Base. Didn't take long before I was flying over there on a contracted aircraft, landing at Osan, and it was like going from night to day. I mean, you went from the relative leisure and comfort of the United States, where you could go down the street, grab a beer in the middle of the night, and a sandwich, and streets were relatively safe and clean. And as we're approaching the base at Osan, I'm noticing that there's concertina wire everywhere. The runway is camouflaged. All the buildings were camouflaged. There were Hawk batteries positioned at strategic points around the base. It was a war zone. And this was in 1982. By this time, America's starting to get over Vietnam. They're going back to the normal daily operations. And here I am smack dab in what looks like a war zone. The squadron was very welcoming, but I was still a second lieutenant. And at the time, because I didn't have any casual time between my normal upgrade training, I ended up becoming the youngest, for about 3 months, the youngest combat flight officer in PACAF as a second lieutenant. And of course, what were we doing? We were basically flying continuation training missions, other missions that were basically patrolling the DMZ.
Yeah.
Now that in itself was an interesting topic, because now you are 24 years old and your job is to take off in the morning. We used to jokingly call it dawn patrol. You fly up to the DMZ with your flight, be stationed in a cap point at one of 2 or 3 places, and you'd go out there and make, I wouldn't call it circular patterns, because we didn't do our caps in circles like you would normally expect to see. We did it in a different pattern in such a way that our radars were always pointing north.
Yeah.
So we could check if anything's coming back down south. We would know what it was. You would see that they would mimic our positions. Where we would go up, they would be there too. And there's a demarcation area. A lot of people don't know this. There's a demarcation area in the DMZ, 5 miles north and 5 miles south, called Restricted Area P518. And it is actually a buffer zone between the 38th parallel, north and south. They're supposed to stay 5 miles north of the DMZ, and we're supposed to stay 5 miles south of the DMZ, and
everybody's fine.
And everybody's happy. Up to a point. Now, the helicopters can get in, but they had restricted status.
Yeah.
Certainly not the fighters and certainly not the bombers.
Yeah.
5 miles on one side, 5 miles on the other side. That's great. Except for I have a radar missile that goes out to 25 miles. And so your cap is 5 miles south and their cap's 5 miles north. And there's 10 miles between you and them. And that doesn't mean a whole lot, because we have them on radar. Yeah. And I'm sure they're looking at us. But at that time, their MiG-21s had a range-only radar. It wasn't a search radar. We had the ability to shoot radar missiles at them, and they didn't have the capability to shoot that far at us. So at any one time, should something happen, of course, then we had the
Things
ability
could get
to,
intriguing.
We could reach out and touch somebody. There's no question about it.
Yeah.
But the irony of it was you could go look across their 10 miles. Although you knew they're there, you couldn't really discern the aircraft they had, even though you have an idea what it was just by its radar signature. But they'd be little dots out there off an horizon, only 10 miles away from you, going back and forth just like you were. And that was always a surreal thought to me at the time that, guys, this could get ugly very fast in a real short time.
Yeah, with a missile that moves at Mach 3. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, so it's covering that distance, 25 miles.
It's
lickety split.
Pretty quick.
Lickety split.
Now, it also got interesting. While the year I was there, we also did have a time, and it happened twice that I know of. Once roughly about the time I was there, and another time before that, where we had a MiG come south trying to escape the north. Essentially, they'd already had one. We were there, and one started coming south. And of course...
A defector.
And you could tell, you could see them on radar because you'd see one target. It's not like it's an invasion. It's one target coming south. 20, 25 miles behind it is another one trying to run it down.
Trying to catch up.
Immediately, everybody gets their nose on it because our ground control intercept radar locations now immediately peak us to. And, of course, you start thinking, I'm going to go get this guy. Well, not so fast, GI. That is an international incident, and you're in South Korea, and they're going to let the South Koreans handle that. And so they pulled us off.
And that's where that politics comes back in again.
Absolutely.
That's where that politics comes back in, man.
The lessons learned.
The lessons learned of geopolitics, man.
Mm-hmm. You're learning it up front and personal as a 25-year-old or 24-year-old.
Permeating everything you do.
Damn those politicians. Anyway, so they intercepted it, bring it back. A couple of months later, we were able to sit in that airplane and take a look at it and exploit the airplane a little bit to get a feel for what our enemy was flying, at least in part. It was that sort of thing that kind of kept it alive all the time. Yeah. I mean, sure, you're in a foreign country. However, the Koreans treated us extremely well. They did not, especially the elders, they did not forget what we did for them during the Korean War. They were very, very kind to us, and I enjoyed being with them. Vicious about not being communists, and you appreciated that. But it was a country that was not as advanced, let's say, as what you came from, and you had to get used to certain things. The food was different, culture was different. You had to be very cognizant of not offending them.
Yeah.
There's certain things you did in the Orient or don't do in the Orient because it would be offensive that we take for granted here. And so things of that nature you learned, how to not just be a tourist in another country, but to actually live in another country. And that was that was a significant lesson learned that you take with you as you go through the rest of your life. After Korea, that was a one-year remote tour. I'm coming up on the end of my tour, and I can either go back stateside or I can stay in PACAF, the Western Pacific. And I decided, no, you know what? I am going to go back to the Philippines and so I applied to be stationed at Clark Air Base. Of course, it's much easier for them to just keep somebody in command. Yeah. That was an easy selection. I got moved down to...
and again, that's where your mom's from.
That's where I was born, actually, in the Philippines. And, my mother...
That's right.
My mother was from Manila, which is another story because my mother was a 13-year-old young girl in Manila when the Japanese invaded. Not a good age and not a good time.
Oh my gosh, I forgot about that.
So she saw a lot of the horrors that we only see in books. To her credit, she never let that take her spirits down.
I never once heard your mom talk about that.
She didn't.
You know that?
She didn't. And that's
all the time that I spent at your house, I never once heard your mom. This is the first time I'm hearing that. I didn't know that.
This is something that I learned.
13-year-old girl and the Japanese in the Philippines, that's not a good combination.
No. And her family, she lost her brother from the bombings of Manila, in the bombings of Manila at the time. So really, she didn't, you would have, a lot of people try to carry that cross. Mm-hmm. And one thing for the rest of their life, and one thing about my parents, and I think it was fundamentally true of the greatest generation, as we like to call them, was they learned the art of moving along, not to let bad times get them down. And again, I didn't realize that back then, but I was to learn this over time.
That's
as
a
I
great
kept
point.
looking back and relating to
That's a great point.
my story, is that generation, unlike seems like ours or the ones that come after ours, seem to dwell on the negative. And it doesn't help. It doesn't gain you anything. No. Yet they were able to move on and can do great things. Yeah. They didn't pass that negativity to our family. They just raised a family of 5 kids, and we were happy. And only as I got older and learned more about history and could relate it to my time in that theater of operations, did it start dawning on me just how special they were. And I actually sat them down and I asked them, I said, Mom, I realized you went through a lot of this. Would you be willing to talk about it? And she just opened up and said, yeah, no problem. They had learned how to put it behind them. Yeah. And she walked me through in bloody detail everything she experienced. And I was in awe, Yet she was the kindest person you'd ever want to meet.
She really was.
And
it was fun seeing your mom at the front door because she always was hugging me.
Oh, yeah. And she was that way. I look at that. I look at my childhood or people's childhood now, and I think, what are we complaining about?
Yeah.
These people went through the Depression, and then they had to go through that. What it made me do, it was appreciate my parents even more.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it also become a little bit more introspective about my life and what's important and what's worth arguing over and what's not.
Yeah.
And so there was a big growing moment for me being in the military, in that theater of operations, and being able to relate that back to my parents' lifestyle. And I'm happy I was able to do that.
Yeah.
But the Philippines was 3.5, 4 years worth of assignment. And the
Clark
Philippines
Air Base.
At that time it was the largest military installation outside of, I think, Eglin Air Force Base. Yeah, certainly the largest outside of the continental United States.
Oh, massive base.
Lots of responsibilities there. By that time, I think you were flying tankers.
Yeah.
I never knew what had ever happened to you.
Yeah.
And had I known you were up at Kadena, I would have found a way to get over there. But we spent a lot of time going back and forth to Korea because that was obviously the hotbed.
Yeah.
During the Cold War, during the years I was in the Cold War. Surprisingly enough, it always amazed me how much play Yasser Arafat and the Middle East got in the news media during that time. Yet we were going back and forth in Korea, and in some cases they were shooting at each other. It never hit the news. Never hit the news, and you wonder, I cannot believe we got a shooting war going on down here.
I know.
And they're talking about Yasser Arafat, and trying to make peace. Okay, fine. They've got problems over there too, but we're not militarily involved in that. In fact, there was one time when I was flying at Osan, and we were doing night intercepts, and we were flying over the Yellow Sea, just doing night intercepts, and the lead ship came across, crackled across the radio, and said, "Knock it off." Which, of course, the call "knock it off" means stop what you're doing.
Yeah.
Safe arm, and let's resort everything. We didn't understand what that meant. We couldn't understand why. We were just about to start an intercept with them as the practice target.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden he calls, "Knock it off." And he said, "Roger, 1, knock it off, 2, knock it off," our typical challenge and response. And the next thing we hear is, "Rejoin on me." So I could turn my nose of my airplane north, got them on contact.
Yep.
We intercept. We do a rendezvous in the night, and we're now in fingertip formation, in a big circling flying pattern, and we're still in the dark, literally and figuratively, thinking to ourselves, what is going on? Is he got an in-flight emergency, an IFE, or what? We keyed the mic and said, "Okay, what's up?" And the response was, "Look down." Well, these are very unusual radio calls, okay? We're making a big circling pattern in the dark, about 15,000 feet mean sea level.
I don't know if I want to look down.
So we look down, and I'm going, I don't see anything. It's just black down here. It's an ocean, so it's all black. The sky is all black. So we're just flying around going, I don't see anything. He says, the next thing you know, he calls back and says, "No, look way down." So now we're looking way down below the aircraft in a bank, and there's 2 boats, and they're shooting at each other.
Oh, jeez.
And it was immediately occurs to us, you got a South Korean and a North Korean patrol boat. And they are hammering away at each other. You could tell which one was the North Korean because they were shooting 37 millimeters. And you could tell they were 37 millimeters because they were coming out in orange balls of 3 at a time. Just doo-doo-doosh. And then you would see them impact, boom, boom, boom. Next thing you'd see a response, it would be just a white straight light, which, of course, as you probably well know, was basically a 20 millimeter Vulcan minigun that they had on the boat.
Yeah.
And they would see these white lightning straight lines go straight back and forth.
Of 100 bullets.
And they went back and forth like this for about 15 to 20 seconds. And finally, we're watching this thing going, holy cow, this is a gun battle. We are flying right around with front row seats. And it's a gun battle in the middle of the Yellow Sea. Yeah. I guess both of these boats had run into each other and decided to start dancing. My nose gunner keys the mic and says, hey, let's go down there and take a closer look. Now, the flight lead was a lieutenant colonel. I can't forget his name. I forget his name, rather. And he had been in Vietnam. He was an old Vietnam guy. Yeah. And he just flat out keyed the mic and said, hell no, we're staying right here. So last thing we need is them start shooting at us. Yeah. Absolutely.
See, boom, boom, boom.
Absolutely.
Boom, boom, boom. Coming up at us.
So anyway, we came around and soon enough, next thing you know, we saw four streaks of white light going from the South Korean patrol boat and impacting the North Korean patrol boat, and then secondaries immediately happened. And just boom, boom, boom. And of course, I'm wearing an oxygen mask, but my jaw was dropping. It must have been down at my knees watching this. And here I am watching this show going, holy cow. So, of course, we wrap it up because now there's nothing going on. It's all black down there, and all we could see is one boat with a searchlight. So we're starting to run on low on fuel. We go back home.
And it's over with that fast, isn't it?
Very quickly. Very quickly.
It's over with that fast.
And what's interesting is there's no epic music in the background. There's no screaming and hollering. It's just dead quiet as we're watching this light show go on down below. Yeah. Puts this whole thing in perspective. You know, people are dying down there, and we're just up here sitting quietly, going around. All you're hearing is the whine of the electronics and the drone of the motors, and it's time to go home. And so we go back, and by practice, we have to file the report. We file the report what we see, which demands a 24-hour response from the headquarters TAC Air Warfare Center that are at Osan. The next day, we're back in the squadron, and we inquire what happened out of our report. What was the response? And the response to us was, oh, the ROCAF said that was just a Korean exercise. I said, sure, you always blow each other up there in your practice exercises.
We always go around sinking North Korean boats.
And that was the way it was. I mean, that was typical of what you would see in the tour. And so, of course, back in the Philippines, it wasn't quite as exciting because you're more rear echelon there, but you did have your moments. There was a time when we were stationed in the Philippines, I was with the 3rd Fighter Squadron, and we were an air-to-ground squadron, which meant that battlefield air interdiction, which is like bombing bridges and fixed targets. We did close air support. We did, but we also did infrared laser-guided bomb weapons delivery, among other things. And one day, we got a frag order that basically said the Novorossiysk fleet from Vladivostok was going to be sailing south. Man. And the Navy was going to follow them up to a point, and then we were going to pick them up. Well, why us? It was going to be a night mission. Why us? Because they were coming down through the north of the Philippines. We were going to pick them up. Actually, we were going to hit a tanker and then pick them up, take as much IR video of the weapon systems, the antennas, the aircraft on board, the number of ships that were following the fleet, basically gather intelligence, video intelligence using infrared paved TAC pods. And so we launched, I believe, 2 flights of 4.
So what time at night is this?
Oh, this is about midnight, if I remember correctly. Videotapes on the capability on the F-4. And these were industrialized videotapes. They were large cassette tapes. Looked like the old VHS tapes on steroids. And we'd plug these things in. They would record what we see through my radar scope.
Yeah.
Which now was turned into an IR video scope with the help of digital technology, which was upgraded into the F4s that were at Clark Air Base, which were newer F4s than the ones we had at Osan.
The DMAS jets.
These were what we call the ARN 101 modded F4 F4 aircraft.
Yeah, and you've got paved tack on these things.
We had paved tack, which is about 5,000 pounds, 45 units
paved drag.
45 units worth of non-genitable drag. So if we ever got caught by another fighter, guess what? We're grapes. We're just moving targets out there because we couldn't maneuver with that much of weight on the aircraft.
Yeah, but you can take a lot of video with that.
Well, we could, and we did. Between the flights, the Wizzos took a whole lot of video of the Novorossiysk fleet, and at one point, you're pretty engrossed in trying to get all of the video and the sections of the boat that the intel guys wanted you to film. Yeah. And you're pretty much buried into the scope, while the pilot is doing the best he can to fly that as smooth as possible so you can get a decent platform. And then when you get run out of fuel, then the next guys come up in and they do the same thing, and they're following him down because the Navy had now released them, and they were in our area. Yeah. We were flying over the top of them. Well, I'm taking video and I'm watching these Yak 28s come off the deck of the Novorossiysk. They're little hot spots, and I thought it was kind of cool. We'd zoom in, and they'd fly up and go off out of my field of view, and
they're flying at night.
Oh, they're flying at night. They are flying at night.
They're flying late at night. Wow.
And so, because they don't like us flying over their ship.
Taking pictures.
As they say, they ain't happy. And so it looks like bees coming out of a hornet's nest, Mm-hmm. But there weren't a lot of them. There was only about 2, maybe 3 that came off. We were filling them in the boat, and about, 10, 15 minutes later, my nose gunner, the pilot, aircraft commander we called him, says, "Hey, Coma, look to your right." And I said, "I'm a little busy right now." He says, no, really, look to your right. So I swing the pod from looking down to looking at my right wing, my right 3 o'clock. And there, right next to us, is a Yak 28. And
hello, boys.
They ain't happy. I mean, you could tell, even it was somewhat blurry, because the IR video back then was nowhere close to the quality that it is right now. But he's trying to wave us off, saying, "Go away, get away from us." And he's trying to get close to us to get us to move. And of course, we're not moving. Now, I thought for a moment, maybe if I just turn on the laser and laze him a little bit. But now I said that would be an international incident. They wouldn't like that, and I'd probably get myself in trouble when I got back to Clark.
So are you carrying any missiles or anything like that?
No,
you're strictly just taking pictures,
no,
and you're unarmed.
We're just
nothing in the gun.
We got 2
TP
tanks.
rounds.
We got 2 370 bags on the wings, and we've got paved drag on the center line. And we're taking videos. And so he eventually flies in front of me, and I just followed him all the way through, which is the video you saw.
I saw.
And he's trying to fly close enough at night to scare us off, to get us to go away. Eventually, we just run out of gas, and it's time to go back.
Yeah.
We let the other teams find him, and they did some filming, and they archived that. And of course, we took that video and we handed it to intelligence as soon as we landed.
Yeah.
And
but you were taking him on paved tack and on the Tizio.
Yeah, basically
tell them what the Tizio is. Tell people what the Tizio is.
A Tizio is a sensor. It's like a giant camera that's mounted on the left wing of an F-4E with an ARN 101 mod. It was a tactical identification system that allowed you, once you got a radar lock, to be able to flip over to this closed circuit television lens and identify it
zoom in
way in advance. It was good out to about 10 miles to be able to see, but it wobbled around a lot, and you had to really be, some were better than others. But it allowed you to get an ID, so you didn't shoot a friendly as opposed to shoot an enemy. Okay, well,
and you got that guy on Tiz.
Yes, basically what I did is as soon as he came out there, it was no longer I flipped the paved tack pod on standby and locked him up on radar, and then flipped it on Tizio and was able to get this guy, flying right in front of us.
Oh yeah, he was in a turn.
And it was just lucky.
Nice turn.
Oh yeah, well, he was only about a half mile out,
Yeah.
And so he came right across the nose, and I got a pretty decent picture of that, and that was all on the video we took. So
At night.
it wasn't much of a picture when you look at it by modern standards.
Yeah.
For a young guy, that's pretty interesting stuff.
I know, man.
It was better than
I'm doing fun stuff here.
It was better than playing video games back home, because all I had was Pong at the time,
Yeah.
I believe.
Yeah.
But that was probably one of the more exciting things that happened. But there were a couple of scares. Every now and then something would happen in Korea, and immediately we'd the order to go get your bug out bags ready, and which we always kept prepared, and off we go.
Yeah.
We would launch. Sometimes we couldn't tell anybody where we were going, and for those who were married, that was kind of disconcerting.
Mm-hmm.
But you almost always knew it was probably going to be Korea, because that's where the hotbed was all the time.
That's what was in the news.
Yep. That was Kim Il Sung's son, Kim Jong Il.
Yeah.
Essentially, that was the game of the day, and so essentially that was it. After that, my final assignment after 10 years in the service was as a flight instructor back in California. Before deciding, gosh, they're going to be cutting the budget yet again.
Yeah.
And by now I was lucky, because I was there during most of it. I was there during the Reagan years, and they were upgrading.
Oh yeah.
They were upgrading all of the all of the systems that we were getting. We had the funding we needed to be able to properly staff and execute the missions that they were demanded of us. And Reagan Reagan did several things that were fundamental to us, because it freed us up. A lot of people don't realize during the Carter years, we were not allowed to shoot anybody unless we were fired upon first. That was this policy. Well, that just means somebody's going to die on your side before you even get a chance to do something.
Yeah.
Reagan changed all that.
Yeah.
And 2 years into his term in office, he literally changed the ROE, the rules of engagement, such that if we thought it was a threat, then we could go master arm on, and that we could go aggressive if we felt it was necessary.
And do what you need to do
to save our lives. And that immediately made a big difference in the attitude in the squadron. And it was huge, because now we were more relaxed. We felt like we could cut ourselves loose.
And there's geopolitics again.
Another
geopolitics lesson.
Creeping into the picture. And that was a recurring lesson that I was going to have to not only grow with, but try to understand as I got older.
Yeah.
Even after I left the military, now you start realizing that there's a lot involved in the decision-making of these operations around the world, and had to deal with, and continues to deal with to this day, that has an impact as to whether they're going to have a successful mission, and of course subsequently potentially even cost them their lives.
Yeah. Isn't it amazing that Sun Tzu had this right 2,500 years ago? His very first chapter, very first paragraph, he talks about what? Geopolitics. You might not like politics, but politics is going to be a part of your life.
Absolutely.
Particularly in the military.
And young men or women don't grow up with this. They don't teach this in high school. They certainly don't teach this in college unless you're a political science major. You learn it the hard way, through hard knocks or through observation as you go through the first few years of your life in the military.
Yeah.
Because you are, in the military, sooner or later, going to get involved into something that has geopolitical implications.
Yep.
And that's what I learned. Leaving the military after 10 years. But really, I was my plan was to stay in the military for 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
Because I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the excitement, and I enjoyed working with the equipment.
Mm-hmm.
I enjoyed being involved with things that were bigger than me.
Yeah.
I enjoyed being involved in activity that was what you saw on the news.
Yeah.
And it was real. And of course, when you were in frontline units like the ones that were in USAFE or PACAF, you, for instance, or the fleets, which were all deployed frontline, the sense of urgency with those units is fundamentally different than what you see in the States. In the States, you get a lot of people that are doing strategy, they're doing a lot of academics, they're doing a lot of training, but they're not inherently involved face to face. They may deploy to areas where all that is involved, but it's the squadron tempo is a lot different.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you can,
and the mindset was too.
Absolutely.
Big time.
Absolutely.
Big time.
They're not as intense. They're certainly not as, the sense of urgency is not there.
Yeah.
Like it is when you're at a place like Osan or Massawa or Kadena or Clark or Ramstein, Keflavik. You can just go down a list of frontline bases where you have guys who are going to be seeing the enemy, if you will, on any given day.
Yeah, either on radar or with the retina.
Absolutely.
Retina to retina or on the radar, you're going to see the bad guys.
Absolutely. And that brings a perspective into your life that you carry with you too, and that is that, look, there's things out there that's serious. Yeah. Just because I'm enjoying life back here in the States, there's a lot going on out there that people don't recognize and commanding our attention or changing our geopolitics, our decision making. Yeah. And that becomes even doubly true now that we're talking about a new administration that is involved in changing the culture and the economics of our domestic lives, but also being observed intently by our enemies, that being China, Russia, the Middle East, Iran, just to name a couple. And they're all looking for us to fail. And they're all looking for a niche in our armor that they can exploit. And I know that because having lived through the Cold War, it may be a different players, different technology, but it's the same enemy.
Yeah.
And
it's the same ideology.
Absolutely. And they're not going to give in, nor are they practicing the Judeo-Christian philosophy of tolerance and compassion. Yeah. They will tell you they are. They will agree with whatever you agree. But when lying is not an issue for you, then they'll tell you anything.
When the ends justifies the means.
Absolutely. They are about as Machiavellian as it gets.
Yeah.
That is something that became very apparent to me since when I was over there, just like so many of us, we weren't there as tourists. We were there living it daily. Yeah. We could see it. We spoke with the locals on a regular basis, and we weren't speaking about whether the pina coladas were tasting good or not. I mean, we were talking about their fears, our fears, because they have families on the front lines just like we do. Yeah. It is real, and that's something that I take with me my entire life. As I got out of the military, you know, I got out because George Bush at that time, George Bush Sr., had already said that he was going to have to cut in order to balance the budget, cut the budget to post-World War II levels, which essentially was nothing. And, of course, we saw that was nothing when we got back into Korea, and our entire military force had been depleted. And we had to ramp right back up again.
For Desert Storm.
Here we go. So I decided, well, it's time for me to get out, because nothing's going to happen, and if they cut that kind of budget, then the type of positions in the military that I was looking for were going to be non-existent or less. Yeah. And I was carrying with me, you know, a pretty good degree, and I figured I could probably find a pretty good job on the outside. Yeah. And so I left. Well, I'll be damned if 3 days later Saddam Hussein didn't attack Kuwait, and immediately I called Personnel Center, MPC, and to see if they could just tear up my resignation orders.
Because the 3rd deployed.
Immediately. They were one of the first
They went to Incirlik Air Base to fight in the Northern War.
They did. In fact, they actually engaged for the first couple of weeks. They actually engaged. And then, because of the age of the aircraft, just were sent home. Yeah. But it didn't take long because, as you know, it only took 100 hours of air and ground war to remove Saddam Hussein from
I still
Kuwait.
keep in touch with Craig Lightfoot.
Really?
Yeah.
I'll be darned.
Yeah, Craig Lightfoot. He was your squadron commander or DO or something like that at the time, I think. Yep. And great guy. Great guy.
Oh, yeah.
He's in Alabama teaching at junior ROTC now.
I did not know that.
I keep in touch with him, yeah.
You happen to know what college? Or
It's a high school.
What's a high school?
It's a junior ROTC.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's... I'm sure there's a person with stories, I'm sure.
Oh, I'm sure.
Well, for me, it was serendipitous, I guess, because even though I didn't get a chance to go into the big play field, even though after 10 years of training and getting wrapped up in small operations, you know, you want to get I was so irritated because I thought 10 years and now they start to party without me. But that's just the way the ball drops. But I would have never been able to get the job in the career that I ended up getting
at Lockheed
Martin
and the F-22 program.
Yeah, I left, and it just worked out that a once classified, highly classified program called the Advanced Tactical Fighter Program was now revealed. The winner of that contest was Lockheed Aeronautical Systems Company, who was headquarters in Marietta, Georgia. Of course, very close to where I grew up. I would have never thought that possibility could happen, because they were, number one, they were making transport airplanes, not fighters. But they had the hangar space because there was a drawdown in the C-5 program, and 141 programs no longer were there, and they had all the space. And
a
so
lot of space.
Absolutely.
A lot of space.
And so Lockheed won that contract and moved the entire program from
Fort Worth.
From Burbank to go into what they call the Engineering, Manufacturing, Development Program, which is really developing the prototype into a production-ready operational aircraft weapon system. But that was going to be a 10-year program. From 1990 to 2000, it was supposed to become operable as a frontline fighter to replace the F-15s in the year 2000. It was a $20 billion development program.
Big program.
Well, they went from having all the engineers they needed to, we need 2,200 engineers, and we need them yesterday. And so I got snapped up, and that's a story in itself. Going into Lockheed Martin, and because of my background, I picked up a position called Requirements Manager for the Air Vehicle Development Program, which is the program that ties it all together into one weapon system. As you know, that program was won by a team head by, as prime contractor, Lockheed Aeronautical Systems Company, but the two preliminary subcontractors that were also involved in that team was General Dynamics Aerospace in Fort Worth, Texas, Boeing Aerospace, Boeing Military Aerospace out of Seattle, Washington. So that was a team that beat out the McDonnell Douglas and the Northrop Grumman team, which themselves had a very good entry as well.
The YF-23.
The YF-23. They ended up...
Before you go on, 6 o'clock. You want to stop here and go get something to eat?
That worked for me.
And off to dinner, Mike and I went. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Lessons from the Cockpit, brought to you by Wall Pilot. Aviation art for the walls of your home, office, or hangar. Mike's two Phantoms are available in 6-foot, 4-foot, and 8-foot lengths if you go to wallpilot.com. On the next episode of Lessons from the Cockpit, Mike is going to go into some of the engineering that went into building the F-22 and why that is such a great airplane, probably the best fighter plane now flying anywhere in the world. But he's also going to compare and contrast why the F-22 program did so well and why the F-35 program is struggling, is over budget and over schedule. So look forward to Mike talking next week on Lessons from the Cockpit. If you've enjoyed this show, please share it with your family or loved ones, particularly if they enjoy stories from the Cold War and aeronautical engineering. We look forward to having you join us next week on Lessons from the Cockpit. Have a great week, folks.